The metal chair creaked under Kethver's weight as he shifted his massive frame. His forearms were bound with energy shackles that glowed blue in the dim light of the interrogation room. The scars across his chitinous armor told stories of countless battles, but none had left marks like the war against the humans. Across the metal table sat Veltar, a thin creature with pale skin and large dark eyes. He held a recording device in his long fingers and watched Kethver with the careful attention of someone who had heard too many war stories? But he had never heard a story like this one. "State your name and rank for the record," Veltar said in his soft voice. Kethver, former battle commander of the Zephyrian Empire's 3rd Attack Division. The words came out like gravel, rough and tired. Kethver's voice carried the weight of defeat and something else that made Veltar lean forward slightly. "You were captured 3 months ago when your fleet surrendered to the human forces. The Galactic Council needs to understand what happened during the conflict. Tell me about the war." Kethver's 4 eyes focused on the investigator. For a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the recording device. Then Kethver spoke, and his words carried a chill that made the air itself seem colder. "You want to know about the humans? They don't fight wars the way we understand them. They orchestrate nightmares." Veltar raised one thin eyebrow. "Explain." "Before the war, we studied every species in this galaxy. We knew their tactics, their weapons, their weaknesses. The Alterans fight with honor but break when their leaders fall. The Crystalline Collective uses perfect formations but cannot adapt when those formations are disrupted. The Void Walkers are fierce but predictable in their aggression." Kethver paused, his mandibles clicking together in what might have been thought or memory. "We thought we understood the humans too. They were new to space, had simple weapons. Small numbers. Their colonies were scattered and poorly defended. Intelligence reports said they were farmers and miners, not warriors. We expected an easy conquest." But you were wrong," Veltar prompted. "Wrong does not begin to describe it." Kethver's 4 eyes seemed to look through the walls of the room, seeing something far away and terrible. "We were not just wrong. We were completely unprepared for what we found." The recording device continued its steady hum as Veltar waited for Kethver to continue. The alien warrior's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and quick. His hands, even bound, clenched into fists. "Tell me about your first encounter with human forces," Veltar said gently. "Kepler 442b, a farming world with maybe 2 million humans? 3 small cities, lots of agricultural settlements. No military bases, no defense platforms. We brought a full invasion fleet. 12 dreadnoughts, 40 destroyers, 200 landing craft. Enough firepower to reduce the planet to ash." Kethver's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "We thought we were being generous by offering them a chance to surrender. And they refused? They never responded to our communications at all. No surrender, no negotiation, no begging for mercy. Just silence. We thought their communication systems were primitive, that they couldn't understand our language. So we began the invasion." Veltar made notes on his tablet. "What happened when you landed?" "The first wave of landing craft touched down in the agricultural areas. The plan was simple: secure the farmlands, cut off food supplies to the cities, force a quick surrender. Standard procedure." Kethver's mandibles clicked rapidly now, a sign of agitation in his species. "The farmlands were empty, no humans, no animals, no movement. But the crops were still growing, the machines were still running. Everything looked normal except for the scarecrows." "Scarecrows?" "Human devices to frighten away birds from crops. Crude things made of sticks and cloth. There were hundreds of them scattered across the fields. Our soldiers ignored them. They were just primitive decorations." Veltar waited, sensing there was more to the story. "The scarecrows exploded." The simple statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Veltar stopped writing and looked up at Kethver's face. Every one of them was filled with explosives. Crude bombs made from farming chemicals and mining equipment. But they weren't just random explosions. They were coordinated, timed, designed to create maximum chaos and fear. Kethver's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if telling the story was helping him understand it. In 30 seconds, we lost half of our first wave. Not to advanced weapons or military tactics, but to farm equipment and scarecrows. The humans had turned their own agricultural tools into weapons. But that was just the beginning, Veltar said, reading something in Kethver's expression. Yes, as our soldiers tried to regroup from the explosions, the humans appeared. They came up from hidden bunkers built into the fields, from underground tunnels, from inside the very machines they used to grow their food. They wore no uniforms, carried no standard weapons. Some were old, some were young, some were barely adults. Kethver paused, his breathing becoming more labored. They fought like nothing we had ever seen. A human farmer with a broken leg continued fighting with a modified harvesting tool. A female barely old enough to breed took down 3 of our warriors with explosives strapped to her body. They didn't retreat when wounded. They didn't surrender when surrounded. They fought until they died, and sometimes they kept fighting after. That, Veltar's writing had stopped completely. What do you mean after that? Humans who were mortally wounded would use their last breath to activate more explosives, to send warning signals, to pass weapons to others. I watched a human male with his torso nearly severed and half use his dying moments to arm a trap that killed 4 more of our soldiers an hour later. The room fell silent except for the recording device. Veltar looked at his notes, then at Kethver's scarred face. How many soldiers did you lose in that first encounter? 40% of our ground forces in the first day. But that wasn't the worst part. Kethver's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The worst part was realizing that this was just... they're farmers. The humans we were fighting weren't even soldiers. They were just people who grew food and raised animals. And they had turned us, the most feared military force in the galaxy, into prey. Veltar set down his stylus and looked directly at Kethver. What happened next? We learned that everything we thought we knew about warfare was wrong, and the humans were just getting started. Veltar adjusted his recording device as Kethver continued his story. The alien warrior's 4 eyes seemed to focus on memories that still caused him pain. After the first day, we thought we understood what we were dealing with. Desperate farmers, using crude weapons. Our commanders believed it was just shock tactics, that the real human military would fight like normal soldiers. We were wrong again. Kethver shifted in his chair, the energy shackles humming softly. The second day, we received intelligence reports about human movement in the northern farming region. A place called Miller's Valley. Our scouts reported seeing military vehicles and what looked like a command center. Finally, we thought real soldiers to fight instead of farmers with bombs. What did you find there? Veltar asked. Colonel Jake Morrison. The name came out of Kethver's mouth like he was tasting something bitter. He was the first human military officer we encountered. We expected him to be like officers from other species. Formal, predictable, following standard military procedures. Kethver's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. Morrison was different. He wore no fancy uniform, carried no ceremonial weapons. He looked like any other human, but when he spoke to his soldiers, they listened with an attention that was almost religious. And when he gave orders, they followed. Then without question, even when those orders seemed to make no sense. What kind of orders? Veltar prompted. He told his soldiers to retreat. Not to defensive positions, not to regroup, but to run away. Our commanders were pleased. Finally, the humans were acting like a defeated enemy should act. We pursued them through the valley, expecting to capture or destroy their forces. Kethver paused, his breathing becoming shallow again. It was a trap. Not just a simple ambush, but something much worse. Morrison had spent weeks turning the entire valley into a weapon. Every tree, every rock, every stream had been prepared, but we didn't realize it until it was too late. Tell me about the trap. The humans had been watching us since our ships entered the system. They knew we were coming long before we arrived. While we were planning our invasion, they were preparing their defense. Morrison had evacuated all the civilians from the valley, but he left everything else looking normal. Kethver's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if the telling was helping him process the memory. When our forces entered the valley, we saw human soldiers running away in panic. Our vehicles followed them down the main road, just like Morrison. Wanted, the fleeing soldiers led us deeper into the valley, always staying just out of reach, always looking like they were about to be caught. But they weren't really fleeing, Veltar said. No, they were leading us to specific locations. Places where Morrison had prepared surprises. The first one was a bridge over a small river. It looked solid, but when our heaviest vehicles crossed it, the bridge collapsed. Not from damage, but because the humans had weakened it in exactly the right places. Kethver's four eyes focused. On the table between them, the vehicles that fell into the river found that the water had been poisoned with chemicals from human mining operations. The poison ate through our armor like acid, but that was just the beginning. What else happened? The trees along the road had been hollowed out and filled with explosives. When our soldiers took cover behind them, the trees exploded. The rocks that looked like natural shelter were actually carefully placed bombs. Even the grass had been treated with substances that caused chemical burns. Veltar stopped writing and stared at Kethver. They turned the entire landscape into a weapon? Yes, but the worst part wasn't the explosives or the poison. It was the realization that they had been planning this for months. Every detail had been considered, every possibility prepared for. Morrison didn't just want to defeat us. He wanted to destroy us completely. Kethver's voice dropped to almost a whisper. By the end of the second day, we had lost 60% of our ground forces, but Morrison wasn't finished. That night, he did something that still gives me nightmares. What did he do? He contacted us directly, not through official military channels, but on an open frequency that all our soldiers could hear. He spoke in perfect Zephyrian, with no accent, no mistakes. He knew our language better than some of our own people. Veltar leaned forward. What did he say? He welcomed us to Earth. He said that humans had been studying our species for years, learning our tactics, our weaknesses, our fears, he told us that everything we thought we knew about warfare was outdated, that humans had evolved beyond the simple conflicts that other species fought. Kethver's mandibles clicked rapidly now, then he made us an offer. He said that any Zephyrian soldier who wanted to surrender could do so safely. He promised good treatment, medical care, and eventual return to our home worlds. All we had to do was lay down our weapons and walk away. Did any of your soldiers accept? 300 of them. They left their weapons and walked toward the human lines with their hands raised. Morrison kept his promise. The surrendering soldiers were treated well, given food and medical care, and were kept safe. Veltar waited, sensing there was more to the story. But the message Morrison was really sending wasn't about mercy. It was about control. He was showing us that he could afford to be generous, that he was so confident in his victory that he could let our soldiers live. It was a psychological weapon more powerful than any bomb. How did your commanders respond? They were furious. They ordered a full assault on the human positions. Every remaining vehicle, every soldier, every weapon we had left. They wanted to crush the humans and end the humiliation. Kethver's voice became hollow, distant. The attack began at dawn on the third day. We had overwhelming firepower, superior numbers, and advanced technology. We should have won easily. Instead, we walked into another trap. What happened? Morrison had prepared for the assault. He knew exactly how our commanders would respond to his psychological warfare. The humans had dug tunnels throughout the valley, connecting hidden bunkers and weapon caches. When our forces advanced, the humans appeared behind us, beside us, and above us. Kethver paused, his breathing labored. They fought like ghosts. We would see a human soldier in one location, shoot at him, and then he would appear somewhere else entirely. Our weapons couldn't hit targets that refused to stay in one place. And every time we thought we had them cornered, they would vanish into the tunnels. But you had superior technology, Veltar said. Technology means nothing when your enemy refuses to fight the way you expect them to. The humans didn't try to match our weapons. Instead, they used our own tactics against us. They studied how we moved, how we communicated, how we made decisions. Then they did things that made all of our advantages meaningless. Kethver looked directly at Veltar. By the fourth day, we had lost 80% of our forces. Our commanders finally understood that we weren't fighting farmers or even soldiers. We were fighting something completely different. Something that had turned warfare itself into a science. What did Morrison do next? He made us another offer. This time, he wasn't just offering surrender, he was offering to teach us. He said that humans had learned from every species they had encountered, that they had taken the best tactics from every military tradition and improved on them. Kethver's voice became barely audible. He said that if we wanted to survive, we needed to understand that humans didn't fight to win battles. They fought to win wars. And they had been preparing for this war since the first time they looked up at the stars. Veltar noticed that Kethver's hands were trembling despite the energy shackles. The alien warrior stared at the metal table for a long moment before continuing his story. After Miller's Valley, our fleet commanders decided to change tactics. They pulled back all ground forces and prepared for orbital bombardment. They wanted to destroy the human cities from space, to end the war quickly and avoid more ground combat. But that didn't happen, Veltar said, checking his notes. No, the humans had prepared for that too. When our ships moved into bombardment position, they discovered that the cities had defense shields. Not military-grade shields, but something improvised from mining equipment and power generators. The shields couldn't stop our weapons completely, but they made precision strikes impossible. Kethvar's voice grew bitter. So our commanders decided on a siege. They would surround the largest city, New Denver, and starve the humans into surrender. It seemed like a logical plan. Cities need food, water, and power to survive. Cut off those supplies and the population would force their leaders to surrender. How long did the siege last? 4 months. 4 months of the most horrifying urban warfare I have ever experienced. And I have fought in 17 different conflicts across the galaxy. Veltar leaned forward, his recording device capturing every word. The siege began normally. We surrounded the city, established checkpoints, and waited for the humans to run out of supplies. Our intelligence estimated they had enough food for maybe 6 weeks. After that, hunger would do our work for us. What went wrong? Everything. Kethver's mandibles clicked rapidly. We learned that humans don't just live in cities. They become part of them. Every building, every street, every underground tunnel was connected to their defense network. The city itself was alive and it was fighting back. Explain what you mean. The first sign was the children. Human children, some barely old enough to walk, were gathering information about our positions. They would play in the streets, seemingly innocent, but they were actually counting our soldiers, noting our patrol routes, and reporting back to their military commanders. Veltar stopped writing. Children were used as spies? Not used. They volunteered. That's what made it so disturbing. These children understood that their city was under attack and they wanted to help defend it. They turned their games into intelligence-gathering operations. We couldn't stop them without harming children, and humans are very protective of their young. Kethver paused, his breathing becoming more labored. But the children were just the beginning. The real horror was Captain Lisa Hayes and her unit. She was in charge of the city's defense, and she had turned urban planning into a weapon. How so? Hayes understood that we expected the humans to fight like other species. Hold strong points, defend important buildings, protect civilian populations. Instead, she made the entire city into a maze of death traps and ambush points. Kethver's 4 eyes seemed to focus on something far away. Every building had been modified. Walls that looked solid were actually thin facades hiding explosive charges. Staircases that seemed safe would collapse when our soldiers reached the middle. Windows were positioned to create perfect sniper nests, and the humans had mapped every angle of fire. But surely your advanced weapons gave you an advantage? Our weapons were designed for open combat, not urban warfare. The humans had studied our equipment and found ways to neutralize our advantages. They used mirrors to redirect our energy weapons back at us. They created smoke screens that interfered with our targeting systems. They even used sound waves to confuse our communication equipment. Veltar made notes rapidly. What about the civilian population? That was the most disturbing part. Other species evacuate their civilians during military conflicts. The humans did the opposite. They integrated their civilian population into the defense network. Shop owners became intelligence operatives. Teachers became tactical coordinators. Even the elderly became part of the resistance. Kethvera's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I remember one incident clearly. My unit was searching a residential area for hidden weapons. We entered a house where an elderly human female was baking bread. She offered us food, seemed friendly and harmless. While we were distracted by her hospitality, she activated a signal that brought human soldiers to surround the building. The old woman was working with the military. She was the military. Hayes had organized the civilian population into a support network that was more effective than most professional armies. The humans had turned their entire society into a weapon. Veltar looked up from his notes. How did your soldiers respond to this? They were terrified. Fighting professional soldiers is one thing. Fighting an entire population that refuses to surrender is something else entirely. Our soldiers began to break down psychologically. They couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax anywhere, couldn't distinguish between combatants and civilians. But you had superior numbers and technology. Numbers mean nothing when your enemy knows the terrain better than you do. Technology means nothing when your enemy refuses to fight the way you expect them to. Hayes had studied every urban warfare campaign in galactic history and learned from all of them. Kethvera's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration or fear. She used tactics that no other species had ever tried. She turned the city's infrastructure against us. Water pipes became weapons when filled with caustic chemicals. Power lines became traps when electrified beyond safe levels. Even the sewage system became a network of tunnels that allowed human soldiers to appear anywhere in the city. What was the turning point? The night attacks. Hayes realized that our species sees poorly in darkness, so she began launching coordinated strikes after sunset. Human soldiers would emerge from hidden positions, strike our outposts, and disappear before we could respond. Kethvera's voice became hollow. But the worst part wasn't the attacks themselves. It was the psychological warfare. Hayes made sure that every night brought a new horror. One night, our soldiers would find their equipment sabotaged. The next night, they would discover that their food supplies had been poisoned. The night after that, they would wake up to find messages written in their own blood. Messages? Warnings, threats, sometimes just human words that we couldn't understand but that sounded menacing. Hayes was breaking down our morale systematically, making us afraid of the darkness, afraid of sleep, afraid of each other. Veltar's stylus had stopped moving. How did it end? After 4 months, our commanders realized that we weren't besieging the city. The city was besieging us. We had lost more soldiers during the siege than in any previous campaign. Our supply lines were constantly under attack. Our soldiers were having mental breakdowns. So you retreated? We tried to. But Hayes had prepared for that too. When we began to withdraw, the humans followed us. They harassed our retreat, picked off stragglers, and made sure we knew that we weren't escaping, we were being driven away. Kethver looked directly at Veltar. That's when we realized the truth. The humans weren't just defending their city. They were teaching us a lesson. They wanted us to understand that fighting them wasn't just difficult. It was impossible. They had turned warfare into an art form, and we were not artists. What lesson? That humans don't fight to win battles. They fight to make sure their enemies never want to fight them again. And they had succeeded. After New Denver, our soldiers were more afraid of humans than they were of death itself. Veltar noticed that Kethver had stopped looking at him directly. The alien warrior's 4 eyes were fixed on the wall behind the investigator, as if he was seeing something terrible that only he could perceive. After New Denver, our fleet commanders made a decision that would haunt us for the rest of the war. They decided to use overwhelming force to end the conflict quickly. They gathered every available ship and soldier for one final assault. "Where did they choose to attack?" Veltar asked. "A place the humans called Blood Valley." It was a mountain region where the last human military forces had retreated. Our scouts reported that the humans were trapped there with no way to escape, and limited supplies. The valley had only one entrance, and our forces controlled it completely. Kethver's breathing became shallow and rapid. The commanders thought it would be simple. We had 50,000 soldiers, advanced weapons, and air support. The humans had maybe 5,000 fighters trapped in a valley with no way out. It should have been a massacre in our favor, but it wasn't. No, it was a massacre, but not the way we expected. The humans had been preparing that valley for months. They had turned it into something that still gives me nightmares. They called it their final stand, but it was really their masterpiece. Veltar adjusted his recording device as Kethver continued. The assault began at dawn. Our forces entered the valley in perfect formation, with air cover and artillery support. The humans were waiting for us, but they didn't fight the way we expected. They didn't form battle lines or defend strategic positions. Instead, they fought like the valley itself was alive and angry. What do you mean? Every rock, every tree, every stream in that valley had been weaponized. The humans had spent months studying our tactics, learning how we moved, how we communicated, how we made decisions. Then they prepared counters for everything we might do. Kethver's mandibles clicked rapidly. The first trap was the entrance itself. It looked like a natural choke point that we could easily control. But when our main force was halfway through, the humans triggered explosives that caused a controlled avalanche. Half of our army was trapped inside the valley, and the other half was trapped outside. You were divided. Exactly. And that's when the real horror began. The humans didn't attack us all at once. They picked us apart slowly, methodically, like surgeons removing diseased tissue. They would hit one unit, disappear, then hit another unit from a completely different direction. Veltar leaned forward. How could they coordinate such complex attacks? They had been studying our psychology for years. They knew exactly how we would respond to different types of threats. When they attacked our left flank, they knew we would reinforce it by pulling soldiers from the right. When they hit our supply lines, they knew we would send guards to protect them, weakening our main force. Kethver paused, his voice becoming distant, but the worst part wasn't the tactics. It was the humans themselves. They fought in conditions that should have been impossible to survive. I watched human soldiers continue fighting with broken bones, with missing limbs, with wounds that should have been fatal. They were that determined. It was beyond determination. It was something else entirely. They fought like they had already accepted death, like they were fighting for something more important than their own lives. I saw a human female with a punctured lung continue to operate communications equipment until she died at her post. Veltar made notes rapidly. What about their leadership? Major Kate Rogers was in command of the Valley defense. She was different from Morrison and Hayes, where they used strategy and psychology. Rogers used something more primal. She understood that warfare isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about will, about the determination to continue fighting when everything seems hopeless. How did she demonstrate this? Rogers had prepared her soldiers for a siege that could last months. But she also prepared them for something else. She told them that if they were going to die, they would make sure that their deaths served a purpose. Every human soldier who fell was positioned to become a trap for our forces. Kethver's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Dead human soldiers were booby-trapped. Their bodies were rigged with explosives that would detonate if disturbed. Their weapons were modified to explode when picked up. Even their medical supplies were poisoned. The humans had turned their own corpses into weapons. Veltar stopped, writing, and stared at Kethver. They weaponized their own dead? Rogers understood something that no other species had ever grasped. She realized that in war, everything can be a weapon if you're desperate enough and creative enough. The humans weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting to make sure that defeating them would cost us everything. How long did the battle last? 6 weeks. 6 weeks of the most intense combat I have ever experienced. The humans never had more than a few thousand soldiers, but they fought like they had 10 times that number. They used the terrain, the weather, even the time of day as weapons. Kethver's 4 eyes finally focused on Veltar. Rogers had divided her forces into small groups that could operate independently. When we destroyed one group, another would appear somewhere else. When we adapted to their tactics, they would change their approach completely. They were like water, flowing around our defenses and striking where we were weakest. What was the turning point? The night of the great storm. A massive weather system moved through the valley, bringing heavy rain and high winds. Our commanders thought the storm would give us an advantage because it would limit the humans' mobility. We were wrong again. The humans used the storm? Rogers had been watching the weather patterns for weeks. She knew the storm was coming and she had prepared for it. While our soldiers were struggling with the wind and rain, the humans moved through the valley like ghosts. They knew every path, every shelter, every hiding place. Kethver's voice became hollow. That night, they hit us from 12 different directions simultaneously. Our communication systems failed in the storm, so our units couldn't coordinate their responses. The humans picked us apart piece by piece, and we couldn't even call for help. How many soldiers did you lose? 40,000. In one night, we lost 80% of our forces. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that the humans had been holding back their full capabilities. They could have destroyed us completely on the first day if they had wanted to. Then why didn't they? Because Rogers wanted to send a message. She wanted to show us that humans don't just fight wars. They control them. They decide when they begin, how they progress, and when they end. We thought we were the hunters, but we were actually the prey. Veltar looked at his notes, then back at Kethver. What happened to the survivors? Rogers gave us a choice. We could surrender and be treated as prisoners of war, or we could continue fighting and be destroyed completely. She made it clear that she had been merciful so far, but that mercy had limits. Most of your soldiers surrendered? All of them. Even the most fanatical warriors in our army understood that continuing to fight would be suicide. Rogers had broken something fundamental in our understanding of warfare. She had shown us that humans don't just win battles. They redefine what winning means. Kethver's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration or terror. When the survivors were gathered together, Rogers addressed us personally. She told us that humans had been preparing for galactic warfare since they first developed space travel. She said that every conflict they had ever fought had been practiced for. The day when they would face alien enemies. What did she mean? She meant that humans had been studying us long before we knew they existed. They had learned our weaknesses, our tactics, our psychology. They had prepared counters for everything we might do. The war wasn't a conflict between equals. It was a test that the humans had designed, and we had failed it completely. Veltar's stylus had stopped moving entirely. How did you feel when you realized this? Terrified. Not just of the humans, but of what they represented. They had shown us that all of our military traditions, all of our strategic thinking, all of our technological advantages were obsolete. They had evolved beyond the simple conflicts that other species fought. And that's when you understood you had lost the war? No, that's when I understood that there had never been a war at all. There had only been a lesson. And the humans had been teaching it to us from the very beginning. Kethver's forearms hung limp in their energy shackles as he continued his story. His voice had grown hoarse from talking, but he seemed unable to stop, as if telling the truth was the only way to process what he had experienced. After Blood Valley, our fleet commanders made a desperate decision. They pulled all remaining ground forces off the planet and retreated to space. They believed that our superior ships and weapons would give us the advantage we needed to end The war. But you had always had superior space technology, Veltar observed. Yes, and that's exactly what the humans were counting on. They wanted us to retreat to space. They had been preparing for space combat just as carefully as they had prepared for ground warfare. Kethfer's mandibles clicked slowly, a sign of deep thought or memory. Commander Rick Stone was in charge of what the humans called their wild card. Squadron, 27 ships, all of them modified beyond recognition. Where our ships were built for standard fleet combat, human ships were built for something completely different. What made them different? They were extensions of their crews. Every human vessel had been customized, modified, and upgraded in ways that defied all military engineering principles. Our ships were standardized, predictable, designed to work together in formation. Human ships were chaotic, unpredictable, and operated according to no doctrine we could understand. Veltar made notes as Kethfer continued. The first space engagement should have been simple. We had 47 heavy cruisers against their 27 smaller vessels. Our weapons had longer range, our armor was thicker, our shields were stronger. By every measure of space combat doctrine, we should have won easily. What went wrong? Everything we knew about space combat was based on fighting other civilized species. Species that followed rules, that used standard tactics, that tried to preserve their ships and crews. The humans threw all of those assumptions away. Kethfer's voice grew distant, as if he was reliving the memory. Stone's first attack was something no sane commander would ever attempt. He ordered his ships to ram our vessels directly. Not strategic ramming to disable specific systems, but full-speed collisions designed to destroy both ships completely. Veltar looked up from his notes. Suicide attacks? At first, we thought so, but then we realized what was really happening. The human ships weren't just ramming us randomly. They were targeting specific vessels in our formation, ships that served critical command and communication functions. Stone was willing to sacrifice his own ships to cripple our ability to coordinate our fleet. That seems wasteful of resources. That's what we thought too. Until we discovered that the humans had been preparing for exactly this type of sacrifice. Every human ship was equipped with escape pods that could be launched at the last second. The crews would survive the ramming attacks and be picked up by other human vessels. Kethfer's breathing became more labored as he continued. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that Stone had calculated exactly which ships to target and in what order. He wasn't making random suicide attacks. He was systematically dismantling our fleet's command structure. How could he know which ships to target? The humans had been studying our fleet compositions for months. They knew which ships contained our flag officers, which vessels controlled our communications, which cruisers coordinated our defensive systems. Stone was picking apart our fleet like a surgeon removing organs. Veltar leaned forward. What did your commanders do? They tried to adapt. They changed formation, modified communication protocols, redistributed command functions. But every time they made a change, the humans adapted faster. It was like Stone could read our minds, predict our responses before we made them. How is that possible? Chief Engineer Maria Santos? She was responsible for the modifications to the human ships, and she had done something that violated every principle of military engineering. She had connected all the human ships, systems together in a network that allowed them to share information instantaneously. Kethfer's 4 eyes focused on Veltar with an intensity that made the investigator uncomfortable. Do you understand what that means? While our ships operated independently, following orders from a central command, the human ships were thinking together as a single organism. When one human ship learned something about our tactics, all of them knew it immediately. That seems dangerous. What if the network was compromised? Santos had prepared for that too. The network was designed to continue functioning even if most of the ships were destroyed. As long as 3 human vessels remained operational, the network would survive. The humans had turned their entire fleet into a single distributed intelligence. Veltar made rapid notes. What happened next? Captain Alex Turner began implementing what they called the Daisy Chain Protocol. Instead of fighting our ships individually, the human vessels would link their weapon systems together to create combined attacks that were far more powerful than the sum of their parts. Combined attacks? Multiple human ships would target the same enemy vessel simultaneously, but their weapons would be timed to arrive at exactly the same moment. The combined energy would overwhelm our shields and armor in ways that individual attacks could never achieve. Kethfer's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but Turner took it even further. He realized that our ships were designed to withstand attacks from specific directions, so he began coordinating attacks from multiple angles simultaneously. Human ships would position themselves above, below, and around our vessels, then fire all at once. How did your fleet respond? Panic. Our commanders had trained for fleet combat against rational enemies who followed predictable patterns. The humans weren't rational. They were willing to sacrifice everything to achieve victory, and they had the intelligence network to coordinate complex attacks that no other species had ever attempted. What was the final engagement like? Chaos, pure chaos. Turner had positioned his remaining ships throughout the battle zone, and they were attacking our fleet from every direction at once. Our sensors couldn't track all the human vessels because they were moving in patterns that defied physics. Kethfer paused, his breathing shallow. Santos had modified the human ships to operate beyond their design specifications. They were pushing their engines, weapons, and life support systems far past safe limits. The ships were literally burning themselves out, but the crews didn't care. They were fighting like they expected to die, but they were winning. They were destroying us. Not just defeating us, but annihilating us completely. Our fleet, which had conquered dozens of worlds, was being torn apart by a handful of modified human ships operated by crews who fought like they had nothing left to lose. What happened to your flagship? Turner himself targeted it. His ship was barely functional, leaking atmosphere and operating on emergency power. But he managed to position himself directly above our command vessel and began a sustained attack that lasted for 17 minutes. Kethfer's mandibles clicked rapidly. My ship was 10 times larger than his, with weapons that could have vaporized his vessel in seconds. But Turner had studied our defensive systems and found a weakness that no one else had ever discovered. He attacked the one spot where our shields overlapped, creating a gap that his weapons could exploit. Your flagship was destroyed? Nearly. Turner's attack crippled our main systems and killed half of our command staff. But just before his ship was destroyed, he transmitted something to us. A message that changed everything. What did he say? He told us that this was just the beginning. He said that humanity had dozens of fleets like his, that they had been preparing for galactic warfare for decades. He said that if we continued fighting, they would show us what real space combat looked like. Veltar stopped writing and stared at Kethfer. There were more human fleets? That's what Turner claimed. And after everything we had seen, after all the impossible things the humans had accomplished, we believed him. The idea that there were more fleets like his, more commanders like Stone and Turner, more engineers like Santos, was too terrifying to contemplate. So your fleet surrendered? The next day, our remaining commanders realized that continuing to fight would result in the complete destruction of our forces. Turner had shown us that humans didn't just fight to win. They fought to ensure that their enemies could never threaten them again. Kethfer looked directly at Veltar. But the most disturbing part wasn't the defeat itself. It was the realization that the humans had been holding back. Turner's final message made it clear that everything we had experienced was just a small sample of human military capability. They had been testing us, learning from us, preparing for something much larger. What do you think they were preparing for? The conquest of the galaxy. Not through invasion or occupation, but through demonstration. They wanted every species to understand that fighting humanity was not just inadvisable, it was impossible. They had turned warfare into a science, and we were their test subjects. Kethfer fell silent for several minutes, his 4 eyes staring at the metal table between him and Veltar. The investigator waited patiently, sensing that the alien warrior was gathering himself for the most difficult part of his story. After the space battle, our surviving ships retreated to the edge of the system. We had lost over 90% of our fleet, and those ships that remained were badly damaged. Our commander sent a message to the Zephyrian High Council requesting immediate reinforcements and recommending a complete withdrawal from human space. But the reinforcements never came, Veltar said, checking his notes. They came. 3 full battle fleets, over 600 ships, the largest military force our empire had ever assembled. The High Council had decided that the humans represented an existential threat that had to be eliminated completely. Kethver's mandibles clicked slowly, a sound filled with regret. The reinforcement fleets arrived expecting to find the remnants of a defeated enemy. Instead, they found something that changed our understanding of what humans were capable of. Colonel Morrison, Captain Hayes, Major Rogers, Commander Stone, and dozens of other human officers were waiting for them. Waiting how? The humans had used the time during our retreat to prepare for the arrival of our reinforcements. They had studied our communication intercepts, analyzed our fleet movements, and predicted exactly when and where our ships would appear. When our reinforcements dropped out of hyperspace, they flew directly into a trap that had been months in the making. Veltar leaned forward. What kind of trap? The entire star system had been turned into a weapon. The humans had positioned mines throughout the hyperspace exit points, had established hidden weapon platforms on asteroids and moons, and had created a detection network that could track our ships from the moment they entered the system. Kethver's voice grew hollow, but that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that Morrison contacted our fleet commanders directly and offered them a choice. They could surrender immediately and be treated as prisoners of war, or they could fight and be destroyed completely. What did your commanders choose? They chose to fight. The idea of surrendering to a species that had existed in space for less than a century was unthinkable. Our reinforcement fleets had enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds. How could they lose to a handful of human ships? Kethver paused, his breathing becoming labored. Morrison's response was to demonstrate exactly how they could lose. He ordered a coordinated attack on our largest dreadnought, a ship that had never been seriously damaged in over 50 years of service. 23 human vessels attacked it simultaneously, using tactics that violated every principle of space combat. What happened to the dreadnought? It was destroyed in 4 minutes, not disabled, not damaged, but completely annihilated. The humans had developed weapons that could tear apart our strongest armor like paper. They had learned to coordinate attacks with precision that seemed impossible. How did they develop such advanced weapons so quickly? Dr. Amy Carter. She had been studying captured Zephyrian technology since the beginning of the war, but not to copy it. She was learning how to defeat it. Every weapon we used, every defensive system we deployed, every tactical advantage we possessed had been analyzed and countered. Veltar made rapid notes. The humans had been reverse engineering your technology. More than that, they had been improving on it. Carter had taken our weapons designs and found ways to make them more efficient, more powerful, more deadly, but she had also found ways to make them useless against human defenses. Kethver's 4 eyes focused on something beyond the interrogation room walls. When our commanders realized that their flagship had been destroyed so easily, they ordered a full retreat, but Morrison had prepared for that too. The humans had positioned ships at every hyperspace exit point, preventing our fleets from escaping the system. You were trapped. Completely. Morrison then made an announcement that still haunts me. He told our commanders that the war was over, that humanity had demonstrated its ability to defeat any force we could send against them. He said that we had 2 choices, surrender and live, or continue fighting and die. What was different about this offer? Morrison explained exactly what would happen if we chose to keep fighting. He described how human fleets would visit every Zephyrian world, how they would destroy our military installations, our government centers, our industrial facilities. He said that humanity would not conquer our empire, but they would make sure that our empire could never threaten anyone again. Kethverus' voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But then he offered something else. He said that if we surrendered, humanity would help us rebuild. They would share their technology, their knowledge, their advances in science and engineering. They said that war was wasteful, that cooperation was more beneficial for everyone. That seems generous for a conquering force. That's what made. It's so terrifying. Morrison wasn't speaking like a conqueror. He was speaking like a teacher who had finished giving a lesson. He made it clear that the entire war had been a demonstration, a way of showing the galaxy what would happen to any species that threatened humanity. Veltar stopped writing and looked directly at Kethver. You're saying the humans planned this? From the beginning? Dr. Carter confirmed it during the surrender negotiations. She told us that humanity had been monitoring galactic communications for decades before making first contact. They had studied every species, every military doctrine, every technological advantage that existed in known space. They had been preparing for galactic warfare before anyone knew they existed. Carter said that humans had learned from their own history that peaceful contact with more advanced civilizations usually ended badly for the less advanced species. So they had prepared for the worst-case scenario. They had assumed that galactic species would be hostile, and they had spent decades developing ways to defeat any possible enemy. Kethverus' mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration. The war we thought we were fighting was actually a carefully controlled demonstration? Morrison and his officers had been managing the conflict from the beginning, allowing us to see only what they wanted us to see, learning everything they could about our capabilities while revealing almost nothing about their own. What happened? During the surrender? Morrison personally accepted the surrender of our fleet commanders, but he also did something that no other species had ever done after a military victory. He apologized. Apologized? He said that humanity regretted the necessity of the war, that they had hoped for peaceful contact with galactic civilization. He explained that the demonstration had been necessary to prevent larger conflicts in the future, but that he was sorry for the lives that had been lost. How did your commanders respond? They were confused. In galactic history, conquerors don't apologize to the conquered. They don't offer to help their former enemies rebuild. They don't express regret for their victory. Morrison was acting according to no precedent that existed in our understanding of warfare. What did you learn from this? That humans don't fight wars the way other species do. They don't fight for territory or resources or dominance. They fight to create a galaxy where war is no longer necessary. The demonstration wasn't about defeating the Zephyrian Empire. It was about showing every species what would happen if they chose conflict over cooperation. Veltar set down his stylus and looked at Kethver for a long moment. Do you consider the humans to be monsters? Kethver was quiet for nearly a minute before answering. No, monsters are predictable. They act according to instinct, according to hunger or rage or territorial impulses. Humans are something far more dangerous than monsters. They are apex predators who have learned to use intelligence as their primary weapon. And that makes them more dangerous? It makes them unstoppable. Monsters can be defeated by superior force or clever tactics. But humans adapt to every challenge, learn from every encounter, and prepare for every possibility. They have turned survival itself into a science, and they have mastered that science completely. Kethver looked directly at Veltar with all four eyes. The war taught me that humanity is not just another galactic species. They are the species that will determine what the galaxy becomes. They have the power to destroy anyone who threatens them, but they also have the wisdom to choose cooperation over conquest. What do you think will happen now? The same thing that happened to the Zephyrian Empire. Every species in the galaxy will eventually realize that working with humanity is more beneficial than fighting them. Not because humans will force that choice, but because they will make the alternative so clearly unacceptable that no rational species would choose it. Veltar turned off his recording device and gathered his notes. Is there anything else you want to add to your testimony? Kethver was quiet for a moment, then spoke one final time. Tell the Galactic Council that the age of conquest is over. Humanity has shown us a better way to resolve conflicts. They have proven that intelligence and preparation are more powerful than any weapon, and they have demonstrated that the future belongs to those who choose to cooperate rather than compete.